take it away.
All right, good morning. I'm Andrew Adams from Stoller Abbott Presser. Also speaking today will be Michelle Abdow from Market Mentors. I'm going to go through the first half of our presentation on crisis communications. My section is going to be about the data breach notification law. It's a newly amended law, passed originally back in 2007, just amended last year, and there are some pretty big highlights and some pretty big changes that went into the law and the amendments last year that are very important to know about, things that you have to have in place for your business if you manage what's called personal information of Massachusetts consumers. And I'm going to get into that in my section of the presentation. When we move to Michelle, she's going to get into crisis communications, specifically talking about what to do when there's a data breach communication-wise, and then what to do in the follow-up after that breach as well. So getting into my first section, I'm going to cover the legal basics about what you need to do, what you need to have in place with your business, and what notifications you have to make if you do experience a data breach, as well as what is a data breach. So getting right into it, the data breach security law itself was enacted back in 2007. It put some things in place for businesses to have some suggestions. And in some parts of it, it was a little more stringent than it needed to be, and put the same kind of standards on businesses, whether they were a small business, with 10 or less employees, and major international corporations were going to follow under the same law. The 2009 amendment actually made it a little easier for businesses to develop their own kind of protection and policy in regard to protecting their personal information. So it does help businesses a little bit, but it also requires you to have some things in place, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. The big reason that I wanted to talk about the data breach security law in reference to crisis communication is because when these laws come out, like you've seen with paid family medical leave, the parental leave law, things like that in Massachusetts, you have a real push of knowledge and learning when the law first comes out, but sometimes it fades off if the law is amended later, and it gets a little overlooked. A lot of companies and a lot of managers and HR professionals are aware that there's a data breach security law, but sometimes we're not up to date on smaller amendments that happen in the law further down the road. So that's why I wanted to get into that a bit today, and talk about the practical application and why it's necessary for you, as employers, as owners of companies, to have these protections in place. Not just because of what the law says, but also that the ramifications that can happen legally speaking. And what we'll do is we'll talk about one case that came up a little bit before the amendment. So the penalties in it are actually going to be a little lighter than you would experience now. But it's a good elaboration of how just any business can be affected by this data breach and is subject to this data breach security law. So the amendment itself, what it did in 2019, is it generated this new list of information that has to be reported, including whether or not your agency has a written information security plan, or a WISP is what we usually call it. And I'll talk a little bit about what a WISP is in a minute. But that's one of the big mandates that it changed. It also requires some extra notifications to be sent out, both to the Attorney General's office in Massachusetts, as well as to affected consumers. And one of the most expensive parts of the new law is it actually adds in the requirement that a company that had a data breach, if that data breach includes social security numbers and identifying information, that they have to provide coverage and credit monitoring coverage and services to those breached consumers at no cost to the consumer for 18 months. So that's a big implication of the updated law. Basically, it requires additional things you have to provide and let the state know and provide upon request your written information security plan. It's something that if you don't have now, you should start asking about because you're required to have it under these laws. And you're going to see this law applies to pretty much every employer. But I wanted to conclude a little bit of important information for you too. There's some links here on this slide. It's got some general information about submitting notifications for data breach and what reporting data breaches to the AG's office entails. So what is a data breach itself? A data breach, basically, it's unauthorized acquisition or use of sensitive personal information that creates a substantial risk of identity theft or fraud. I'm going to tell you in a second what exactly that information entails and what specifically you have to track if it's breached. Data breaches can be from anything. They can be from criminal cyber activity, a hacker, ransomware. The biggest one that triggered the amendment in the law is the Equifax data breach. So companies that just are license information, acquire personal information because that's their business model, but it's also things like emailing information to the wrong person. If you are a company that has employees, if it's not just, you're not just an independent contractor, but you have employees, even if you have 1 or 2 employees, if you have their personal information and their personnel records, that is going to be considered sensitive personal information. And you need to have a WISP in place and a security policy that talks about how you're protecting your employees' personal information. So you can see every company with 1 employee who is a Massachusetts resident or doing business in Massachusetts as a Massachusetts consumer is going to be covered by this law. So it's not just companies bringing in this personal information and licensing it out, or companies doing retail transactions, but also any company with any employees whatsoever. Those personnel records are going to fall into this as well. So you can see how you might need to tailor your policy a little differently if you're working with paper files for your personnel records as opposed to thousands of transactions, financial transactions, or things of that nature. So specifically, what is personal information? What requires these protections, and what do you have to know if this was the information that was breached is going to be considered a data breach? So the law is very specific about this. It's any Massachusetts resident's first and last name or just the first initial and last name. And you take that in combination with any 1 or more of the following data that relates to that specific resident: social security number, driver's license number, state issued ID number, financial accounts, their credit card, debit card. It doesn't have to be with their access code either. So if you retain financial transactions and records of those transactions that have the full number on there as well as the name of the individual, that's going to fall under this as well. So it doesn't include information that's publicly available, that's addresses and birthdays, but you need to be wary of it. And I would reach out to your counsel or an association and just verify that the information that was breached isn't specifically personal information. Because if it is, it triggers a notification which needs to occur pretty quickly after the breach. So it's a rapid-paced process, which is why you need to have these policies in place so you can check very quickly to see if this constitutes a data breach and be able to notify in regard to that. So as you can see, some of this information is information that you would have from your employees in your personnel records. If it's bank account information for direct deposit accounts, things like that, as well as employee's name, any breach of those records is going to be considered a data breach. And it doesn't have to be, getting on a little tangent, it doesn't have to be somebody from the outside of your company sneaks in and steals a personnel file or record or something like that. It just has to be any kind of breach. If an employee accidentally emails it to the wrong person, if somebody gets into that personnel file in the outside of the company, if you have a vendor that's coming in that's cleaning and they have access to the personnel files, things like that, even if it wasn't done with malice or any kind of malintent, it may be considered a data breach, and it's something you have to look into. So why do we care? What's the penalty for us if we're not in compliance with this? There's a couple cases out there, the biggest being the Equifax data breach, but everybody's heard about that. We'll talk about that in a minute. I think Michelle's going to touch on that as well. So I didn't want to dig into it here on the legal side, but I just wanted to show you how it can affect a small business. So this was right before the amendment was passed or even thought of, because it takes a little while to pass these amendments. But Commonwealth v. Haney, it's a Massachusetts Superior Court case, happened in 2016. It's the only time I'll actually talk specifically about any companies or businesses because it's a case and it's good to be illustrative here. So this was a real estate closing attorney, and he worked as a solo practitioner. It was just him in the office at the time, as far as the facts of the case outline. And what he does for those, he has to maintain files It's one of our rules of professional responsibility to maintain files and things for at least 6 years in certain matters. So he has to retain his client files. And what Haney does is he contracts with a third party, which a lot of companies do. Storage space, especially if they have paper files, is a premium. And it can be cheaper to find somewhere to store those files. So he contracts with a third party. And that third party is not really a verified third party. It's not like you're storing it at Iron Mountain or something like that, where they have some security measures in place and they're used to document retention and data protection and things like that. It's just this unnamed third party who, from the facts of the case, looks like it could have been a friend of his that he was just storing there, or an old associate. And at some point in this relationship, it must have gone sour, because someone discovers a box of these closing files and all his client's information in an open field, just on an open field next to a well-walked trail. And they see this information and they find his contact information and they let people know about it. And obviously there's some fallout from that, because you're closing on a house, you don't want all your financial information being found by any hiker on a trail. So that gets to the Attorney General's office. And they find out that, not only was he not securing his files properly, but, he didn't notify anyone of the data breach right after it happened, besides those people who discovered it on their own. He didn't maintain any of this information security protocols or plans regarding his client files or Massachusetts consumers' personal information. So a couple of things there, he violated a couple of parts of the statute. So what the AG did was they came in, they brought a suit. They get injunctive relief, just means that they're forcing him to do something. The court can force you to do something. So they force him to develop a WISP within 2 weeks, maintain that WISP if he's going to continue practicing and having personal information from consumers. He needs to have all these protocols in place. He needs to provide it to the Attorney General's office. He has to notify clients. At the time, none of them had been affected, or they weren't aware of anyone actually getting that information besides the person who discovered the files. So there were no outside breaches, but this is before the credit monitoring. They actually ordered him to be on standby, and if anyone had experienced a breach of their personal information because of that, he was going to have to make amends with them and be subject to damages from those parties, which kind of is what happens now with the 18 months of credit monitoring as well. So they ordered that, but they also fined him $10,000. And the point of that is that this is a breach that affected only a handful of client files. It wasn't disclosed to any party besides whoever discovered it in the field. And he still was going to be fined $10,000 for that violation. So it's not just the state's going to come in and order you to do something, but you need to be careful of fines and penalties as well. So just know that you're not just subject to that injunctive relief if you don't have these policies in place. And that's another big thing that the state put into this new law is if you experience a breach, they're going to ask for your WISP, and they're going to ask to see it. They're going to ask to see if it was amended in response to any kind of breaches, if there were any updates to it over the years based on your security, things of that nature. And are you training your employees on data security as well? In this situation, he didn't really have any employees to train, but going forward, if he hires individual employees, that's also part of it. He would have to train them on data security protection protocol as well, which is why we always recommend people to have a WISP policy, which is a little longer policy, which we'll talk about in a second, as well as a separate employee handbook or internal policy document as well, which is a little bit smaller and details what employees' responsibilities are with data security protection. Things like maintaining personal passwords and not sharing that information with anybody else, logging off of computers when they leave the work, not letting other employees at the business log on to their profiles, things of that nature, as well as security protections on phones if you have access to personal information. Because it doesn't just mean your central records, but it also extends to side records as well, or devices that have access to those records. So when we remote connect in, now that everybody has been working from home as much as they can, your computer's at home, if you're now accessing information, you need to have security on those as well. Cell phones, if you're getting client files that come into you via cell phone messengers or email and things like that. And in these WISP, they allow you to tailor your policy to the needs of your business and to the level of data security that it needs. So does every email need to be encrypted? No, but there are some that do. So we'll talk about that, tailoring your policy in a second. But those are some of the things you need to look out for. You know, I wanted to show you a practical view of what a small business could go through if they had a data breach, and kind of data breaches you don't think about. You know, when you hear data breach, you think digital, you think email, you think Equifax, but it can be personal records. It can be client files in your office. You know, it's that old, could be old pen and paper. It doesn't even need to be a computer generated file, things like that. So it's very expansive, and you got to think about all those little side pieces of information you wouldn't normally think about in the age of technology, in the digital age. This was going to be our opening question. We were looking for an estimate from people. How many data breaches do you think occur in Massachusetts? And as you can see, when it was passed in 2007, you only had a couple months there. So but in a couple of months, you still had 17,503 residents that were affected. And now, while some of these numbers are repeats, as companies, when they report it to the AG's office, they don't have to say, they don't look back and say, you know, Andrew Adams experienced a data breach in January and now he's getting a second one, so we take that number off. Some of these are doubles, so you know, it's not exactly half of Massachusetts in 2017 experienced a data breach, but as you can see, you know, between 2010 and 2020, at least the end of 2019, there were over 10 million data breaches in Massachusetts or affecting Massachusetts residents. So it's a serious issue, and there's a lot of reporting that needs to happen. And individual reporting, so when you're looking something at like the Equifax data breach, I don't know how many specifically out of the 2017 breaches were specifically from Equifax in Massachusetts, but looking at the numbers, it could have been 2 million or more. You have to individually notify every single consumer of their rights under that. So, you know, it's not specific, it's not, you know, here's our form letter, we can send it out to everybody, because maybe the data that was breached in regard to my file is not the same as the data that was breached in regard to Michelle's file. So those notices might be different, and you can see the impact that it could have in your business when you're going through and having to monitor all these separate client files or individual breaches in this massive breach. So that's why it's very important to have an updated information security protocol. It's very important to talk to your IT contractors, your IT department, and you know, just to ensure that if it's technology based, that it has all the protections that it needs to have, and it's up to date. Because technology, hacking, ransomware software changes so rapidly. So you need to adjust as rapidly as they do to protect this information. That's something the state's going to look at as well. Were you on notice of this from your IT provider or from the third party that you store your files at? Things of that nature are going to be included as well if the AG has to investigate a data breach. So all things to have in place. Just know that it is something that occurs, and it occurs with quite frequent basis. Even after the Equifax data breach, when everybody was scrambling to make sure that everything was up to date, you can see even the year after, there's still over 400,000 data breaches. And you know, it may not be social security numbers, but it can be financial account information. It can be driver's licenses, things like that. And things like that lead to other things. So as you can see with the Equifax data breach, you know, almost half of the United States is affected by the Equifax data breach. The fallout from that afterwards was this data was sold to third parties, and for a good portion of the Massachusetts unemployment claims that were filed that were false in the last couple of months, they actually bought the data from the Equifax data breach to file unemployment claims on behalf of Massachusetts residents. So a big story, big developing story the past couple of weeks is that the Equifax data breach resulted in this unemployment scam in Massachusetts. So it can be this long play where data breach from 2007 affects somebody in 2020. So you can see the fallout continues after these data breaches as well. But just, you know, it's an ongoing issue. It's always going to be an issue, especially as we get more technologically based. But it's good to keep up to date on these things. I wanted to include this year because basically what happens when you notify the Attorney General in the state about this is you're required to submit certain information about the breach itself, and that becomes public. So not only are you going to, have to work with affected consumers and work through things like credit monitoring, and different notification with them, as well as providing policies and things like that to the state. But it's also going to be public information. It's almost like they post a shame list online of everybody experiencing data breach. I wasn't going to do the same thing, so we blacked out the organizations here, but I wanted to have just see how the depth of it is. They published the organization's name. They published the date reported, what type of breach it was. Did it occur at your entity? Did it occur on your servers or through your business? Or was it through a third party that you contract with? Both parties in those situations have to report the third party and you. So even if it's not your fault, the contractor that you're working with to maintain your records or that client information, if they get a breach, you also have to notify. How many residents were affected? You can see the top list on here. The first couple ones were only one individual. Still needs to report to the state. There's no minimum threshold. So even one person's information, that could be your employee. A personnel file was breached. Now I need to notify the state. So as you can see, it's pretty expansive on what notifications need to be made. Was the social security number breached? Account number, driver's licenses, credit, debit cards, and you offer to provide it. Did they accept the credit monitoring? Was it provided as well? As you can see with the social security numbers, you do have to provide that credit monitoring. The person doesn't have to accept it, but you have to let them know it's out there. Was your data encrypted? Was the mobile device lost or stolen? What's not published on this page, but you do have to report to the state, was one person responsible for that breach? You have to say who was responsible for the breach. If it was a third-party provider, you have to provide their information and an explanation of what they were breached, and make sure that they're on notice of that as well. If it was someone in your own office and the breach was very specific, you have to provide that information to the state as well and say, this is my director of human resources is AB, and this is how the breach occurred. So they're going to ask you things like that. That's not going to be public information, but just know that you're going to have to provide it in those circumstances. So what is the WISP, the Comprehensive Written Information Security Program? It's a mouthful. It's why we call it a WISP. And if you ever talk to me or anybody else related to it, we're just going to say WISP. So basically, it's the larger policy that you need to have if you own or license personal information, which we talked about a little bit earlier, about a resident of the Commonwealth. So if you have any of that information, if you have one employee, you have to have this in place. You got to develop it, specifically tailor it to your business, implement the program, and maintain a comprehensive information security program document that you can supply to the state upon request of when a breach occurs. After the breach occurs, it's very critical that if you experienced it, you develop and review the risk-based written information security program. And what you do here is you have to update and tailor it. You tailor it to take into account your business's size, the nature of your business, amount of resources that you have available. They're not expecting a 3-person business to have, this programming encryption software that costs $40,000 a month. You're not going to be placed on the same level as a global bank or something like that. It has to be tailored to the needs of your business. And that's why it's called this risk-based approach. It's especially important if you're running a small business like that to make sure that it's not putting you out of business to maintain records to stay in business. So what you need to do after a breach is just make sure that you've updated it in response to that breach. And you want to list what actions you took and maintain a record of that as well, and what you changed, and a record of the original WISP and the new WISP to show what I changed to respond to this breach. So you want to keep all that information. I would keep it for as long as you think that the breach might affect you, at least a couple of years just in case. There's no real timeline on when you have to maintain certain records, but those are big things you want to keep because the Attorney General would ask for that. So again, one of the new things about the amendment is that if you experience that breach, you have to report whether you have a WISP, the Office of Consumer Affairs and Business Regulation, and the Attorney General's office, and they're going to ask to see it. They're going to ask to see if you've made any updates in the past, as well as asking if you updated it in response to this data breach that had just occurred, and what you're doing to change it to make sure that it doesn't occur again. It's another big thing they're going to look for. So a couple proper components of a WISP. It should have several elements, and it's different from what employees see. An employee is going to see, hopefully, like a paragraph or two explanation of what they should do for data protection, unless they're responsible for the WISP. Proper WISP itself is going to have a couple of elements. It's going to have objectives. It's going to outline what it's supposed to, these are data security protection of employee files, of client information. It's going to go through the purpose of it, to protect information in response to Mass General Law and CMR, and go through it all. The scope of it. Is it personnel files? Is it client information? Does it cover this specific department? Things of that nature. It's going to outline who your data security coordinator is that's responsible for maintaining, updating, and ensuring employees are trained on their data protection duties, and what their responsibilities are. It's going to talk about any precautions that you put in place for internal risks. It's going to talk about, is there a policy in your handbook? Is there a smaller handbook policy that employees have access to? And then precautions for external risks. Is there a different policy for your personnel files that are located in the office? If they're paper files, then there are for client information that's probably digital. What are your precautions in both different areas? And what is your data security coordinator doing, or who are the outside providers that you're contracting with to ensure that your data is protected? So when do I need to report the data breach? Within a reasonable amount of time. It doesn't mean you have to, call up the AG's office. We just had a data breach 3 seconds ago. This is what happened. It doesn't have a specific timeline. Don't wait a month to report it. Get all the information necessary you think you're going to need to respond, and respond as quickly as possible. So what you're looking at is you do have to, again, notify the Office of Consumer Affairs and Business Regulation, the AG's office, but you want to make sure that notification happens as quickly as possible, and they can happen on a rolling basis. You don't even have to know the full extent of the breach, but what is the extent that I know right now? I know that 10 were breached. Let me notify that there's 10, there may be more. And it's kind of an ongoing rolling basis notification system. Another thing that's very important to understand, some breaches are a result of breach from a third-party vendor or other entity, which we talked about. So in addition to those regular reporting requirements, the law also requires financial institutions and things like that to identify when a debit or credit card, the issue is compromised. So the breach could have occurred at the retailer where, they swiped the card, they purchased something, there was a breach of that information, but the financial information that was issued by the bank is the card. So that was breached. They have to report that breach as well. So you have to be very aware of what the extent of a breach in your line of work could be. It might not just be a breach of your own systems or your own policies and things like that, or personnel files, but it could be a breach of a third party that you don't even have contract to that third party. The breach could require you to notify the state as well. So just be wary. There's a couple of different elements here. There's a couple of different ways that you could be involved in a data breach through no fault of your own. It's not saying that there's fault on you specifically because there was a breach, but just outlines, a notification to protect consumers in the case of a breach. So that's why that's in place there. The notification to the state, you're looking for a detailed description of the nature and circumstances of the breach of security or unauthorized acquisition of personal information. How did it happen is basically all it's saying. Who was the employer responsible for protection of information? Where did that breach come from? How did it come about? What, the nature of the third party breach, the agency that we contract out to secure our records, they had a breach of their file room, things like that. How is what kind of information was acquired, and how it came about. The number of Massachusetts residents affected as of the time of the notification. Again, it's a rolling basis. So we know 10, okay? this is who's affected that we know now, and there may be more we'll continue to notify as it develops. What steps have you already taken? The third-party vendor has now purchased additional security. There's 3 locks to get in there now and a PIN pad that only 6 people have access to, things like that. Our personnel file records are now in a separate locked room within the HR department in an office. They require 3 keys to get to them now, things like that. It doesn't always have to be we increased, our digital security. It could be physical barriers that you put in place to impede someone's access to that information as well. Any information regarding whether law enforcement is investigating the incident and kind of any steps that need to be taken subsequent to the notification. Notification letter has to also go out to affected consumers, notifying and updating them. Again, this can be done on a continuous basis, and it's got to be in accordance with the notification that we outlined earlier, and credit monitoring and providing things of that nature. A general notification letter has to go out to the AG and the Office of Consumer Affairs and Business Relations website, which notifies what you're doing in reaction to that breach. That contains a couple of different things than the personal letters need to contain, but that gets published on their website as well. Just a slide outlining the notice to consumer, what you have to send to your consumers, things that we just talked about, what to include, what you don't have to include in the personnel file. Just wanted to provide you that information on the slide so you had a quick reference to it in case you need it in the future. And now I'm going to leave it off to my partner, Michelle Abdow, who's going to take it away for keeping calm in a cyber crisis.
Good morning, everybody. Bear with me for a moment while I share my screen. And I hope everybody can see the screen okay here.
Yeah, looks good, Michelle.
Okay.
There you go. Yep, you're in
Perfect.
PowerPoint presentation. Go take
Awesome.
it away.
So, Andrew covered all of the legalities and making sure you're buttoned up, but we all know that that's something that can happen that could completely impact your business in a negative way, is if you do have a breach and the media or the consumers in the world hear about it. So we're going to talk a little bit about what happens in a cyber crisis and how you can potentially control the situation as best as possible from a public perception. So Andrew talked a little bit about all of the different types of data breaches, so I won't go through all of them, but hacking, ransomware, and then the one that we all know that we have done, and that is sending emails to the wrong recipient. So that is something that is very commonly can happen. So what happens once something bad happens? What do? You need to have a public relations strategy. You need to have a plan. So what are you going to do? The last thing you want to do when a crisis strikes is actually have to come up with what that plan might look like. So it could be anything from a bad product that you might have, but a data breach is really rather significant. And Andrew talked a little bit about Equifax, and I'll speak a little bit about that as well. In today's day and age, with digital advances, with social media, with iPhones and everybody having technology at their fingertips, it's really important to make sure that you have a plan in place in the event that something bad happened. So the first part is identifying the who. Who in your organization should be the one that addresses this? It really needs to be thoughtfully planned out in advance. So it could be, it's a cybersecurity breach. You might think that your IT person would be best off speaking to people because they're technologically savvy, but they may not be the right person to speak to the media. You may not want to have a public relations person because they might be, they might look like they're selling snake oil. It might be the owner of the company or the president or the CEO, and it may end up being counsel. You need to identify who your company spokesperson is going to be and make a decision in terms of what is going to be said. I'll cite a little bit. In 1989, one of the biggest crisis communication issues happened, and that was the Exxon Valdez. And one thing that Exxon did that they did wrong is, instead of sending out the president or the company CEO, they sent out a line of second line of command people sent them up to Alaska, and it really basically told people that they didn't care. So they ended up with a real negative connotation in the marketplace. It was pretty bad, actually. So what are you going to say? What you present and how far you go with what happened really needs to be articulated. Typically, we always say be transparent. You don't have to give a paragraph of information, especially when talking to the media, because the media can take any word that you said and mix it to be the quote that you said. So you have to be very articulate. It has to be very direct, and you need to have it kind of mapped out in advance and stick to your talking points. But one thing we always tell people is be honest. Customers want the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So be like Abe. So when a breach occurs, you need to, decide where are you going to do this message. Is it going to be a press conference? Are you just going to issue a statement? Is it something that's going to be broadcast on the media outlets? Are you sending out a press release? Are you going to put it on social media, on your company website, on all of your social media platforms? Are you sending out e-blasts? So you need to talk about what is your strategy of where you're going to post this information. And the information will need to be written appropriately for that specific audience. So think about where your customers are, where you normally would communicate with them. And that's where you need to be. You need to make sure. So if you have let's talk about younger audiences. If you know that you have a younger audience, and you need to make sure that your message is heard, you may want to be on all social media platforms. Versus if you are more of a retirement services plan, maybe a lot of your retirees aren't going to be on Snapchat. So you might want to be on LinkedIn and e-blasts and statement stuffers and letters and all kinds of communication. So you really want to make sure that you're putting out your message in the right place so you can make sure that it's heard by the audience. And then when do you do it? We'll talk a little bit about Equifax as well. So Equifax, and Andrew touched upon it as well, it took them 6 weeks to even report that there was a data breach, and it was 143 million customers. That's huge. Think about the United States. We have 340 million people. So, it's a lot. It affected a lot of people. So don't follow Equifax. You want to be on point, get your message buttoned up, and you want to take it to the marketplace as quickly as possible. And remember, a wound only heals as fast as you start tending to it. So you want to tend to the wound as quickly as possible. And why? Why do you want to communicate? It all comes down to loyalty to your brand. Handling a crisis quickly and successfully can ensure that you retain that business, that loyalty that you've worked so hard to build to begin with. So, accidents happen, things can happen. We all make mistakes every day. Heck, we talked about sending an email to the wrong recipient. That happens all the time. So you have to be very careful when it does happen, but you also need to make sure that you address it so you can maintain your brand loyalty and your consumer following. So companies who meet the crisis head on may be able to emerge a lot stronger with a closer connection to their customers. Admit your mistake, let them know what you're doing to fix it, let them know what you're doing to maintain their loyalty, and you'll gain a lot more. You'll lose people, but you'll eventually gain them back. If you've done a good job to begin with, they'll always come back. And when you're in a crisis, always look inward, not outward. Always look outward, not inward. In other words, look at it through the eyes of your customer. Don't look at it through you. Well, we didn't mean to do that. It's more of how would this person feel impacted, and making sure that you're actually being more resolved to their needs. So after the delivery, what do? We like the wash, rinse, and repeat cycle. So you have your talking points. You're going to stick to your talking points. You never sway from them. You don't change your opinion. You don't change where you stand on things. You basically have stated the facts, and you're going to stick to it. So you wash, rinse, and repeat. It's not a set it and forget it situation. So repurpose the content over and over again until you can emerge out of this a lot stronger. So the takeaways. One of the things we like to say is who's on the team? Who is going to be on your team? Is it going to be your IT manager? Is it going to be the company's CEO and president? Are you going to have counsel involved? and at what level? Are they going to review all of the communications before anything is distributed? And then who are the advocates? Who's going to be your spokesperson? Is it going to be somebody from the IT department? Is it going to be somebody from marketing or public relations? Are you going to hire a spokesperson? Could it be your counsel? So you really want to make sure that you have that. And then make sure you have that security team in place. Kind of backwards, but you should have already had that. Everything that Andrew has already discussed. You want to make sure you have all of your I's dotted and your T's crossed, your WISP plan in place, and then what is going to happen, God forbid something happen in the event of a crisis communication issue. So determine your legal obligations, evaluate your situation, and continue to repeat over and over again. So the best crisis plans are like insurance. You never want to have to tap into your insurance, but you want to make sure that you have it. So if you need it, you know you're covered. So crisis communications are consistently evolving. They're like a game of chess. You're really dodging strategy, or you're challenging your strategy. It requires making sure you know what your opponent is going to do. And in this case, the media becomes your opponent, but they can also become your best ally. So if you did something really bad, the old adage in the media world is if it bleeds, it leads. So if something bad happens, the media is going to cover it. So it's your chance when the microphone is on you to twist that narrative and to become a positive ambassador of your company. So a data breach can be a real test to a brand's resiliency. This is a shot of 1989 from the Exxon Valdez. It really is important to talk about what we've learned from them. While Exxon was not about privacy, heck, the internet wasn't really even around at that point, it became a case study of what to do and what not to do during a crisis communication issue. First of all, by sending the wrong people to Alaska and not addressing it head on was one of their biggest mistakes. But they finally did seek counsel, and they did hire a crisis communication consultant who basically said, look, let's address it head on. Let's apologize for what happened, and let's tell the world that we are not going to stop until every bit of this is cleaned up. And as soon as they did that, they became the good guys. And they did vow a commitment, and they did actually lead the charge of what to do in the event of an oil spill. So they went from 24 hours later to becoming the good guys. So it's a good testament. So you want to make sure that you're addressing things right away, showing that you're solving a problem, and then making sure that you're moving forward and maintaining that brand loyalty. So a team with experience can jump in and respond efficiently and effectively to help weather the storm. Like the unpredictability of New England weather, you never know about a breach or a crisis when it could strike. So you need to be prepared to weather the storm. Have a plan in place and the steps that you should take in case you are hit by breached lightning. So that is our presentation for today. We're happy to take any questions for those of you that are in the room. And I know that this video will be shared as well. So happy to take any questions. Val, are there any questions at this point?
If you have a question, you can either unmute yourself and ask, or if you prefer, you can type it in the chat pod down at the bottom. If you're on an iPhone, you'd have to swipe one way or the other, and then just type your question. So we'll give it a moment to see if we have any questions.
I went through mine rather quickly, so
Yeah,
I'm happy
that's
to
good.
have anybody email me afterwards if they want to chat a little bit more about it.
Yeah, no, it was done well. Okay, so hearing no questions and not seeing anything in the chat, I'm assuming we're all set. The next breakout sessions begin at 11 o'clock. If you go back to
Hang on, I'm supposed to be sharing that. That's my bad.
Oh, so, yeah, no worries. That's all great. So if you go back to the link, again, the access code is 20VLLC. Also, if you were in the keynote today, we know we had some technical issues. We're fortunate that we're going to have the keynote again tomorrow at 7:45. We'll have Meredith Elliott Powell back with us. And all those technical gremlins are going to be taken care of today. So hopefully that will work well. Thanks for joining us today. I also want a huge thank you to Michelle and Andrew for their expertise in providing this critical information. So thanks all.